Hello, friends, and welcome once again to an episode of The Bible Yogi. I am your host, Douglas Roberts. Hope everything is going well in your world. Um, Today, we will be continuing our foray into the life of Moses. And we're going to be looking at the book of Exodus, chapters 21, 22, 23. And we just finished receiving the Ten Commandments from God on Mount Sinai. And now God is giving Moses some of the more finer points of the law, some of the day-to-day stuff. And it's funny because I find this material rather academic and rather dry, but it's funny because I happened to see another YouTuber pastor talk about this sort of thing, and I thought his insights were amazing. And I was kind of taking the basis of the Mosaic law for granted, and truly, it is not something to take for granted. Like, for example, the point he was making was private property, and private property is a mainstay and is a stalwart in the law of Moses in Leviticus. You'll see today that when someone steals something, they're supposed to pay it back or pay it back double, or for things like oxen and things like that, you have to pay it back fivefold. And then I started realizing, wow, the law, if you compare the Leviticus law to like modern America or something, or I tend to immediately like to compare, governments to the Russian governments during the Stalin era, because I've studied that quite a bit, or even Lenin or the Tsar. My dad had a big interest in Russian history, so I've kind of inherited a little bit of that interest. But I've studied a lot of communist governments and things, and so I always compare everything to that, and I go, well, that's so wrong. And that's what this pastor did. He said, look, private property doesn't exist in these other governments. And here, God nominates private property as a mainstay of the government. So I said, well, that's pretty cool. No wonder why I like it so much. It's like the basis of capitalism was, way back when in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, right? But another thing I found incredibly interesting was a comment that Pontius Pilate made in the Article volume, where he was talking about that the scribes and Pharisees, they just extract, tithes and gifts from the people to feather their own nests, to make themselves wealthy or whatever. But in truth, the Bible doesn't, especially the Leviticus law, it says, just give them, offerings. And eventually the priests, they make all these offerings up to God, but then they get to eat them, the cows and stuff. So if you think about it, the 11 tribes of Israel end up giving sacrifices to God, which are then used to be kind of like, think of it like taxation to the Leviticus, the tribe of Levi, so that these people, this tribe, can remain priests and scribes to God. And then God will rule over your country, and he will drive out, famine and disease and robbers and other people in the land, and he'll do it in a very peaceful way when possible. So I just thought all of those thoughts popped into my head, and I thought, well, that's pretty cool. So anyway, on we go. Right away, though, we run into an issue that I've heard people just slam, oh, the Bible justifies slavery. So let's see, does it really? It certainly mentions it. As followers of this channel know, we just watched as Moses led the children of Israel out of the bondage of slavery in the Egyptian Empire. So now what, right? Well, so I wrote up this little chart of a reality check, the ancient world versus and 1860s in America. Um, and just compare the two societies and compare the implementation of slavery. There's always been this age old dilemma of labor versus management throughout history, that we've always had people that needed to tend the flocks, grow the food, do all that, dirty work. And then there were people that had to make sure everything else was running, that women and children were taken care of and educated, and buildings built, and dams built, and highways maintained, and the more complicated engineering feats that needed to be accomplished. Building the Roman Colosseum, for example, it wasn't building the Egyptian pyramids and the Sphinx, and building all the Egyptian tombs. It's amazing, and I hope I brought this out adequately when I was discussing Egypt. But the Egyptian Empire was an incredibly advanced civilization. They did stonework that we don't know how they did it today. We don't know how they did it. They put 40-ton blocks of stone 70 feet in the air. How in the world did they do that? I don't care how many humans you got, you could never lift up something with human power alone that high. So, but they managed to do it. And anyway, so it's fun to do all these comparisons of civilizations and empires. But today we're going to be looking specifically, at least for the next few minutes, and it's not the whole video, but we're going to be looking at the landscape of slavery, and how it was implemented back in Egypt and back in Israel, and then of course compare that to America, because we're most familiar with the American version. Now, reality check: the ancient world did not have a welfare state, right? You couldn't just sit there and petition, the welfare office to give you SNAP benefits and medical benefits and all that. None of that existed. There were no convenience stores. There was no mass communication, no phones, that kind of thing. There was no mass transport, right? You couldn't get on a plane and fly across Israel at any time. There was no air conditioning. There was no indoor plumbing, irrigation, and even getting fresh water was a challenge. So why do I mention this? Survival was hard. Much, much harder than any of us born in America since World War II. Can't even imagine. With the exception, of course, armed forces vets. Let's not, go into that whole sidetrack. But I'm talking about normal pew-filling sheep, and especially my generation, which was lucky enough to be born right in the middle, where we dodged every single war in the past century by some miracle of timing. I was too young to go to Vietnam. Didn't exist during Korea. I missed World War II. My dad, even though he was old enough to go to World War II, he was stationed in Germany toward the very tail end of the war, and he never saw battle, thankfully. But anyway, just stuff like that. My whole family, we dodged all those bullets, all those horrible wars. Anyway, so next, let's look at the differences in the characteristics or the implementation of slavery. Now, in America, there was a slave trade coming out of Africa. So there was an institution over there that would round up a tribe or round up various tribes, and these people that rounded up the tribes were tribes themselves. Or maybe a tribe would even sell some of its own people, into slavery for things like weapons and stuff like that, or money. And we bought them and we brought them over here. But it was against their will. That's the point. That's the main point. And when American slaves were brought over here, they had no rights at all. It was the most, the fact is that the slaves were entirely at the mercy of their owners, okay? And so not every owner was like the guy in Django, the movie, complete psychopath. There were enough psychopaths out there, though, to get the North Christian abolitionist movement off the ground, and they decided that there was enough inhumanity going on that the North wanted to end slavery, and so they fought a civil war over it. And they won, for that matter. So, one for the good guys. Anyway, back to the Bible for a moment. You could be captured and sold into slavery if you were from a different country, different city, captured by a conqueror. Oh, and once you got captured by a conqueror, you were either killed or enslaved, one or the other. There was no option 3. So a lot of people just gladly became slaves because their leadership had failed them. Their army failed. So now what are they going to do? You know, better to be alive and a slave than a dead dog. Like, no, what's this expression? Better a live dog than a dead lion. So there you go. Another important distinction is state-owned versus privately owned. And this is what the Egyptian Empire, all those slaves in Egypt, the Israelites, they were owned by the state. They were owned by the empire. So all their food was controlled and all their labor was controlled by the state. But they did return to their own homes every night. Okay? And then en masse, they were allowed to go, leave Egypt to go worship in the wilderness for 3 days. But then Pharaoh himself went out after them with the chariots because all those slaves were owned by the empire of Egypt. Now in America, slaves were not owned by the state. They were owned by individual owners, plantation owners. And so treatment of these slaves differed from household to household to household to household in the South. Whereas, I wasn't there. I wasn't in Egypt, so I can't speculate. But the idea is that you would expect a certain amount of continuity of treatment across the entire Egyptian empire. But there's another difference, was voluntary versus involuntary servitude. This is what happened in Egypt. It's a pretty huge demarcation of slavery. In Israel, you volunteered to become a slave, or you were a conquered person. But people, this could happen due to extraordinary events like famine, war, or destitution, or as repayment for debts or crimes. But in Israel, slavery or servitude, as they like to call it, was not permanent. They would enter into a contract, and that contract would expire after 6 years, and in the 7th year, they were allowed to go free. So if I incurred a debt that I couldn't pay, then I was sold to cover my debt to somebody, and then I became their servant for 6-7 years. It's unclear to me. It says in the 7th year he goes free. So I think it's 6 years, and then boom, you're gone. The funny thing is, though, as you'll see, is that female slaves were permanent. Once you bought a female slave, it was as if you bought a wife, and she was yours forever. At least that was the intention in the nation of Israel. Now, one thing else I wanted to point out, to the people that are shocked that Israel would have had slaves as well, one thing they didn't have was jails. They didn't have jails and prisons. And in our society, we've got something like 1.7 million prisoners currently in the United States. That's a lot of people. And Israel did not have that. Your crime kind of fell into a couple of punishment. Either you were killed because you did something completely egregious, like you killed somebody else, or you stole something and now you just have to pay it back, which reminds me again of government, right? In our judicial system, the criminal who is caught stealing something, let's say he steals your car, He can be arrested and thrown in jail, but the victim does not get recompensed in any way. It's like I always wondered about that. What good does it do me if you find the thief who stole my car and you throw him in jail and I don't get anything out of the deal? It's like, could we just garnish his wages or something? Or you could give me his car and sell it or something? Or should the state, recompense the victim? I don't know. But in Israel, they made the thief recompense the victim. So I like that. I think that's a pretty cool rule. And finally, charity and welfare was for the widows, orphans, and the handicapped back then. They didn't give charity and food to military age fit men. It just did not happen. You worked until you died. That's all there was to it back then. So those were the differences. And as far as I'm concerned, the institutions, especially when you compare the American to the Israeli and then to the Egyptian, there's so many differences with the way it was implemented. We just have to appreciate the fact that this has been the dance of humanity forever. Call it what you will, but there's unskilled labor, skilled labor, and then there's management thereof. And we live in a time where we are, especially in America, extremely wealthy. When you consider, there's this book I read a while ago called Naked Economics, and it talked about an economic wealth index. And his calculation was very simple. It was 200 years ago, most people spent most of their time with eating. In other words, or things involved around eating, growing food, taking care of cows, slaughtering cows, carving up the meat, storing the meat, salting the beef, creating the bacon, yada, yada, yada. And it was like 90% of their energy was spent dealing with just getting food, keeping food, cooking food, etc. I don't know about you guys, but I don't spend 90 minutes, or 90% of my time. I don't spend, I probably spend 90 minutes a day, but not 90% of my time. I go grocery shopping once a week, and then, I've got a microwave oven. I want something hot, it takes me 5 minutes, 15 minutes to make a decent meal. It's certainly not all day, like 16 hours a day just to make a meal. No. So that was how this gentleman measured wealth in a country. So I thought, man, and he wrote this book back in the 70s. So imagine what he'd think nowadays with our microwave ovens and fast food. But I don't know if we've gotten much better since then. Anywho, slavery laws in the book of Exodus, chapter 21. Now these are the judgments which thou shalt set before them. This is God himself speaking to Moses. If you buy a Hebrew servant, and an Israeli brother, 6 years shall he serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. Like I said, 6-year contract. And if he came in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he were married, then his wife shall go with him. So there you go, freedom. It wasn't a permanent thing. But if the master has given him a wife, and she hath borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be the master's, because he paid for that person. And the original slave shall go out by himself. But if the servant plainly says, I love my master and my wife and my children, I will not go out free. I'd rather remain a slave in this guy's household. So this was the intent of these laws, is that people treat each other nice. And people treat each other nice enough that even the slaves want to remain in that station, because why not? They have their family with them. They have a roof over their head. They've got labor that they can handle, and they are provided for. Then his master shall bring him unto the judges. He shall also bring him to the door and unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl. And he shall serve him forever. And that's the little marking symbol, kind of like a, notching the ear of a cow or something, right? And now, this is funny. I got in an argument with this guy about this. And I missed the point back then, but he did really. He did worse than me, but I missed this point too. But let's see if you can catch it out there. If a man smite his servant, punch him, or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Surely. Okay, we'll get back to that. Notwithstanding, if the slave who got beaten continues a day or two, he shall not be punished. The owner shall not be punished, for it is his money. Okay, so let me explain this a little bit. Barbaric means you can beat the crap out of your slaves as often as you want, as long as they recover. That was this guy's argument. Well, the funny thing is that even this right here is more rights extended by the nation of Israel to their slaves and servants than the American version. So we're already a step above, a step ahead. But what's actually happening is, no, let's just read this next thing here. If a man smites the eye of his servant or the eye of his maid, that it perish, that loses his sight in one of the eyes, then he shall let him go free for his eye's sake. So, yeah, you can beat them up, but if you kill their eye or, something, then they're allowed to go free. And if you smite out his manservant's tooth or his maidservant's tooth, he shall let him go free for the tooth's sake. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was a little kid, I got in a fight or two, and it wasn't too hard to lose a tooth. You get punched hard enough, and out goes the tooth. So this was a safeguard, to rein in abusive masters. You beat them too much, then they get to go free. All right? But also, I wanted to point out, though, because I don't know if I had it conveniently coming up, so I'll just tell you. When it says, he shall surely be punished in verse 21, chapter 21, verse 20, later on in I think 22 or 23, they talk about the punishment for murder. And the fact is that the punishment for murder was you die. The state will stone you to death. And the only way that this wouldn't happen is if you claim it was an accident, you didn't mean to, and then you could run to the altar and grab a hold of the horns on the altar and plead your case once they came to drag you away. But if they find out that indeed you did plan this murder, you did mean to kill the guy, then they would be stoned even from the altar. But if you went to the altar, then you would at least get the benefit of a hearing, okay, before the elders and all that, before the priests. But you were still punished, right? You didn't escape. If you killed a slave, then you were culpable. And this is a far different thing than the American thing. In other words, the slaves, they didn't lose any you were still punished for harming a slave, just like they were a citizen. Now, when it says, if he continues a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his money. What is he talking about? Well, one of the provisions we'll see later was if two guys get into a fight, right, and one of them beats up the other one and the guy has to go to a hospital, the winner of the fight had to pay his hospital bills. And he had to give him money for all the time that he lost recovering. Here, what God is saying here, it's like you're only hurting yourself. The slave that you own, you got to pay for him to recover because he's already under your roof, right? You have to pay for him to get better. You're the one losing money. So that's why it says he shall not be punished. But the punishment is take care of the guy, restore him to health. But you had to do that anyway since you were the owner. Now, this is where things get controversial, I'll say. And this is female slave laws. If a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out as the men servants do. Meaning there is no 6 years and your contract is fulfilled and you're gone. If you buy a female slave, this is a very different thing. Obviously, this is like I don't want to say an arranged marriage, but it's of that kind of a deal where someone comes up and says, I want to buy your daughter. And the guy says, well, okay, I don't want to speculate on what would lead a man to want to sell his daughter into being a wife, but that's what this is talking about. And if she please not her master, who hath betrothed, anyway, so it says she shall not go out. That literally means this is never ending. You buy her, it's permanent, right? She's going to be your responsibility for the rest of her life. And if she please not her master, who hath betrothed her to himself, then shall he let her be redeemed. Meaning she can leave. And you'll see why. To sell her unto a strange nation he shall now have no power, seeing he hath dealt deceitfully with her. In other words, the contract was to keep her for life. And now all of a sudden he's not thrilled with her anymore. And you'll see there's actually, we'll read it. And if he had betrothed her unto his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters. And if he take him another wife, her food or raiment and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. Those three things. And if he do not these three unto her, then she shall go out free without money. So if he displeases her and she doesn't want to stay with him, she can buy her way out. That's what this scripture is saying. She has to let her be redeemed if he finds out he doesn't like her anymore. But he has no power to just sell her to anything he wants. So she's got that right. Finally, if he marries her off to his son, he didn't take her for himself, then she's his daughter-in-law, and she gets all the rights of a daughter-in-law, and which is like an actual daughter at that point. Then even if he finally says, I'm going to take another wife who I actually love, then her food, her clothes, and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. And if all these three are not under her, then she shall be able to go free. Now this reminds us, of course, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who all had multiple wives and multiple handmaidens under their tent, if you will. And a lot of this was because you had to have children in your old age. You had to have someone to take care of you. There was, as I said before, there was no welfare state waiting to take care of you. There was no Israeli old folks home over there. Your children had to take care of you and your grandchildren and that kind of thing. So if you didn't have any of that, you were out of luck. So that's why people did this sort of thing. Everybody, And with that, I'm going to let that go, and we're going to cover capital punishments and other forms of punishments later at a later time. Hopefully, I've provided some perspective for all these most controversial laws. Till next time, everybody, please take care.